everyone, here is our last video about photosynthesis, and this is all about the scientists who helped us understand what we know about photosynthesis today. And their work started pretty early in the 1600s. So in about 1643, we had this guy, Jan van Helmont. And van Helmont, he was wondering what makes plants get bigger. And so he did an experiment where he had a small new baby willow tree, and he had about 200 pounds of dry dirt and 5-pound baby willow tree. So he measured that out so he could understand what was there. And then every day he watered the tree just like you would normally water a plant. And after 5 years, he had 199 pounds of dry dirt and 169 pounds of willow tree. And so at this time in the 1600s, people thought maybe trees grew because they absorbed the soil. But look, he started with 200 pounds of dirt and ended with 199 pounds of dirt. Did losing 1 pound of dirt really change and cause the tree to grow? Well, probably not, because the tree gained about 164 pounds. So did that 164 pounds come from that 1 pound of dirt that was lost? No, probably not. Where did that 164 extra pounds of the willow tree come from? Well, the only thing he added to the tree over time was water, which means that water caused the tree to grow. And that tells us, when we're thinking about photosynthesis, that, hey, water might be getting used by plants. And if you remember back to our equation on photosynthesis, you will remember that water is part of the equation. Water is actually a reactant, or something that is going to do the reaction. So water is used during photosynthesis. Water is taken in by the plant. So Van Helmont helped us start to think that water is used by plants, that water might be part of some reaction that takes place in plants. And now, of course, we know that reaction is photosynthesis. All right, about over 100 years later, we had Joseph Priestley, and it was about the 1770s. And Priestley, he was doing some experiments with what we call a bell jar. So if you think about it, if you've seen Beauty and the Beast, you've seen a bell jar before because it's over the rose that the beast has. But if not, just here's a picture of it. So he had a bell jar, a candle, and a plant. And he found out that plants must release some sort of substance that would keep a candle burning. And when he put the bell jar over a candle by itself, the candle eventually went out. It's kind of like if you have a candle at home and you put the lid back over the candle, if it's one of those kind of big jar candles, you put the lid over it, what happens? Well, the flame goes out. And that's because fire requires oxygen in order to burn. And we had kind of known that. We established that fire requires oxygen to burn. And so Joseph Priestley, he had a big enough bell jar that he put a plant and a candle in there, and it took a lot longer for the candle to burn out when there was a plant under the jar with it. The reason that it took so much longer for the candle to burn out when a plant was under the jar too is that the plant must have been producing oxygen that would allow the fire to keep burning. So Priestley really let us know that plants produce oxygen. And you think back to photosynthesis, I know this takes me a second to get back to it. Oxygen is a product or something that is produced. It's actually produced by the light reactions. You can see oxygen there being produced. So Joseph Priestley's experiment showed us that oxygen was produced by plants. All right, when was oxygen produced by plants? What part of the reaction was oxygen produced? Well, that was up to Jan Ingenhousz. So Ingenhousz was working around the same time as Joseph Priestley, and this was in 1779. He did a little experiment with some aquatic plants, Elodea, and he did this. He put the plants in a sealed container, and he had one container that was not in the sunlight, that was kind of in the dark, and one container that was in the sunlight. And he found out that the container that was in the sunlight produced bubbles, but the one that was in the dark did not produce bubbles. Okay, so where did these bubbles come from? Think about that. If you have oxygen gas underwater, if you have gas underwater, it is in the form of bubbles that are going to float up to the top of the water. And so what he figured is that the oxygen gas was produced in the sunlight, but not in the dark. And so that tells us that when is oxygen produced? Because Priestley told us oxygen was produced. But when is the oxygen produced? It's produced during the light reaction. So you have to have light in order for plants to produce oxygen. So some other things might be happening in the dark, like the Calvin cycle, but the light reactions that produce oxygen are happening in the sunlight during the day. And that is Ingehauss's contribution. All right, we're getting like 150, close to 200 years later. We have this scientist named Melvin Calvin, and he was a pretty brilliant guy. This took place only about 70 years ago. And so if you think about the development of our knowledge over the long period of time, in the big scheme of things, this really wasn't that long ago that we started to understand this. But basically, think about this. Priestley and Ingenhousz, they provided information that helped us understand the light reactions. But Calvin, he helped us understand what happens in the dark, or what happens when light is not required. So the other part of photosynthesis. So remember, Priestley and Ingenhousz help us understand the light reactions. Calvin, he helps us understand this process, the light-independent reactions, like how does carbon dioxide get turned into glucose? So basically, he set up this experiment where he traced the chemical path of carbon, like what does carbon look like at each stage of this cycle, and how does it actually form glucose, sugar? So how do you go from carbon dioxide and use some ATP energy to make glucose, sugar? And that is always been known as the light independent reactions or the dark reactions. But because Melvin Calvin did so much work to help us understand that process, we named it after him. So it is now called the Calvin cycle. If you do something really cool in science, it could be named after you too. So that's it for the Photosynthesis Scientist. What you will find in Canvas, if you need some extra practice, is this review slide and a video where I talk about this review slide. It just kind of puts all of these ideas together that we have talked about. So just a real quick recap, there's the scientist that we just talked about in this video, but the overall equation for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water plus light energy gives us glucose and oxygen. Where does photosynthesis take place? It takes place in the chloroplast. And where are the light reactions happening? Well, they're happening in the structure that's part of the chloroplast called the thylakoid. Where is the Calvin cycle taking place? That's out here in the stroma, that gel-like material of the chloroplast. And what are the reactants? In other words, what goes into photosynthesis? Well, light energy, water, H2O, and CO2, carbon dioxide, all go into photosynthesis. And what comes out? Oxygen, gas, and glucose, sugar. Thank you so much for listening. Your module in the optional supplemental activities will have the photosynthesis practice and some different resources to help you. But 3 of them are going to be involved in your activity for this week. So look forward to seeing those. Thanks for listening.